Now let's go back to the beginning of mental testing and look at people like Binet, Terman, and Hollingworth. The evolution of mental testing begins with Francis Galton, who was technically the first person to measure individual differences in humans. He did this in the 1880s with his test of physical and perceptual abilities. But his tests were not mental tests. They were focused on reaction time, vision, hearing, things like that. Along with some of the other early pioneers, Galton supported the nature argument of mental ability. He believed that intelligence is largely inherited from our parents and our ancestors. We don't learn, we don't change our intelligence. In 1890, James Cattell coined the term mental test when he published a study that he had conducted with some of his students. Unfortunately, he couldn't validate his tests, meaning what he thought they would predict, they didn't. He thought they would be related to students' grades, and they weren't. Yet he is still considered a pioneer in mental testing and applied psychology. After he was fired from Columbia University in 1917 for his opposition to World War I, he sued the university, won, and established the Psychological Corporation, one of the first consulting firms in the world. This consulting firm initially failed, as Cattell in the leadership role. Other psychologists eventually came on board and helped salvage the business and make it into a fairly successful company. In 1904, in Paris, France, school officials needed a way to identify students who needed remedial help, who needed special classes. The following year, in 1905, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon solved the problem by creating the first intelligence test, the Binet-Simon scale. It was designed to assess low ability. That was its initial purpose. It was revised in 1908 and 1911 before being replaced by the Stanford Binet in 1916. Binet and Simon created different versions of the test for different ages. On the slide on the left, you see the version for 3-year-olds, and on the right, you see the version for the 13-year-olds. We might ask a 3-year-old to locate different parts of their bodies. We might ask them to repeat sentences, repeat numbers, name the members of their family. For 13-year-olds, obviously the questions need to be more appropriate. We might ask them to draw and design different things. We might ask them to describe the differences between two different objects. Even today, the best intelligence tests come in different forms. There are different versions depending on who you are assessing. Here's another example from the 1908 version of the Binet-Simon scale. The test taker would show a child two faces, such as those in the top row, and ask the child to pick which face is the prettier of the two. If you believe that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, you may not agree with this type of question. Today, we don't use questions like this anymore. I just thought it would be interesting to show you an example of some of the early questions. So how did Binet and Simon create their test? First, Binet gave Galton's perceptual abilities test to his two daughters, but their scores were not all that different from adults' scores, which is a problem. If we're trying to identify students who need extra classes, but we can't even separate their scores from the adults' scores, then that test is probably not going to work for our purposes. He did notice some small differences on the mental processing tasks. His daughters did not perform as well as the adults on these specific items. He concluded that Galton's tests were not measuring mental ability. They were not going to work for finding students with low ability. The second thing he did was test two groups of students. One group was considered normal, the other group was considered impaired in some way. To make his scale, he chose other mental tests that were available at the time. They weren't intelligence tests, but they were tests of mental processing ability. He chose those tests and those items, compiled a large draft of an intelligence test, tested these two groups of students, picked out the items that showed differences, the items where the normal, quote unquote, group scored high and the impaired group scored low. Those particular items were chosen for the Binet-Simon scale. He came up with the classification scheme that you see at the bottom of the screen. He divided the scores into different mental levels. A child's mental level was meant to describe the mental age at which the child is functioning. French children who scored at a mental level 2 years lower than their actual age were classified as débiles and placed in special classes in the French school system. Binet's beliefs about intelligence were quite different from those of his colleagues, and his ideas eventually influenced many modern psychologists. Binet believed that intelligence is multifaceted. There are different dimensions, different components of intelligence, and he believed that intelligence is made up of a variety of different skills. It's not just one thing that we should be measuring. There are multiple components that we need to look at. He also believed that intelligence could increase with training. He believed that a set of mental orthopedics, he called them, could help children raise their mental level. He also believed that we should put limitations on the use of intelligence tests. He created the first one and recognized how it might be abused. He also differs from his colleagues in this regard. Many of the psychologists who come after Binet choose to use tests to solve every problem they come across. Tests, 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 all about the tests. Binet in the early 1900s recognized that tests could be abused, that the results were not completely objective. For this reason, he also believed that intelligence should not be assumed based on one test. We should use several different types of tests before we make assumptions or conclusions about one's intelligence level. Henry Goddard is responsible for bringing the Binet-Simon scale from Europe, from France, to the United States. He discovered the test when he was on a trip to Europe. He earned his doctorate from Clark University and studied with G. Stanley Hall. In 1906, he started working at the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Girls and Boys in New Jersey. Feeble-minded was the word that was used to describe children who were lower than average in intelligence and in mental ability. He was the director of research until 1918. During his time at the training school, he established the first known laboratory designed to study intellectual disability as opposed to ability. Like Binet, Goddard also tried to use Galton's studies of perceptual abilities, but did not find differences, did not find evidence that those tests were related to mental ability. Between 1910 and 1914, Goddard tested over 20,000 school children using the Binet-Simon scale. The test did show individual differences, which was a good thing. It was good news for the test. The results also validated what many of the teachers had already observed. After the test had been administered, some of the teachers would point out to Goddard the students who they thought needed extra help. It turns out that the Binet-Simon scale was able to identify many of those students who the teachers had pointed out. We call this validation. It provides evidence for the test, that the test is actually measuring mental ability. Based on his results, he created his own classification scheme, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen. For children who scored at a mental age of 1 to 2, the lowest on the scale, he called them idiots. For those who scored at a mental age of 3 to 7, he called them imbeciles. Those who scored at age 8 to 12, he called them morons. Now, these terms today have very negative connotations. They did back then as well, but they were used more readily. So it's not completely insane that he would use such derogatory terms to describe children. At the same time Goddard was testing these students, he was also testing immigrants at Ellis Island in New York City. It had been built in 1892 by the federal government to handle the incoming immigrants, to assess them, scan them, take their documents, record them, all of that. 15 years later, by 1909, Ellis Island had processed more than 1 million immigrants coming to the United States. Another 15 million were on their way. To enter the United States, the poorest immigrants, and only the poorest, had to pass a series of tests. They had to undergo a physical examination and prove that they didn't have any contagious diseases. They were also required to prove that they could work, that they were able and willing to work. The wealthier immigrants didn't have to take these same tests. They had to take some tests, but fewer tests. Between 1911 and 1913, Goddard and his team of researchers administered the Binet-Simon test to thousands of immigrants. Most of them scored at a mental age of 12, what he called morons. As a result, hundreds of them were deported. They were never allowed to enter the United States because of Goddard's process. Many of those who were deported were confused. They didn't understand the test. They didn't understand the instructions. Many of them did not speak English as a first language. So some of the physicians and the other employees on Ellis Island noticed these problems, noticed some of the issues with Goddard's application of the Binet-Simon scale. They noticed these issues and brought the problems up with administration. Eventually, the test was no longer used, but not before hundreds of individuals were turned away for reasons that were probably not appropriate, not relevant. Remember that Binet warned against this. He had said when he published his scale that it could be abused and could be used to hurt people instead of help them. Goddard is also well known for doing something that many people do today: compare people's families, their mother's side with their father's side, and draw conclusions about that individual based on the differences that they notice. So let me tell you a little bit about one of his case studies that he published in the early 1900s. He studied the family of one of his patients at Vineland, Deborah Collicock. What he was trying to do was prove that intelligence is inherited. So he did an extensive study of Deborah's family members on both her mom's side and her dad's side. He compared the data and concluded that one side of her family was more intelligent than the other side. He looked at things, for instance, like infant death rates. On one side of her family, the good side, only 15 infants died at birth. On the bad side, as he called it, on the bad side of her family, 82 infants had died at birth. He concluded that one side of her family had better genes than the other, and these genes contributed to their survival. Goddard did not consider any environmental differences. Can you think of a reason why one family might have a lower infant mortality rate than the other side of the family? Yes, it could be genes. It could be that one side does, in fact, have superior genes. But what are some of the environmental, the social, the cultural factors that might play a role in these differences? Education, nutrition, social support, right? All of these things we know today to play a role in learning and development. Goddard did not consider any of these differences. He didn't look at income, education, access to healthcare. He didn't look at any of those variables. He used these differences that he found to support his initial idea that intelligence is inherited. His case study is an example of how researchers are sometimes biased by their own perceptions, their own beliefs about some phenomenon. Like many of his colleagues, Goddard believed that those who showed signs of mental impairment should be institutionalized and removed from society so as not to be a burden on the rest of us. Binet and Simon created the first intelligence test. Goddard brought it to the United States. Louis Terman is responsible for developing the best known intelligence test, the Stanford Binet, which is now in its 5th edition. It was published in 2003. Terman went to Clark University and earned his PhD in 1906, several years after Goddard had earned his PhD from the same university. They both studied with G. Stanley Hall. Later, Terman would end up at Stanford University, where he first taught and researched and then became the chair of the psychology department. In the early 1910s, Terman started working with the Binet-Simon scale, trying to translate it, revise it, standardize it. In the process, he came up with his very own intelligence test, the Stanford Binet. He chose this name to epitomize the university where it was created, Stanford, and also to give credit to Binet, the originator of the first intelligence test. To standardize his test, he tested 2,300 children and adults, and then developed norms for his test. Norms provide meaning. If you get a 75 on an intelligence test, what does that mean? It doesn't have a meaning unless you have others to compare your scores to. If you find out that the average is 75, that other people typically score 75, that gives your score of 75 some meaning. Terman is also responsible for introducing the concept of intelligence quotient, IQ. IQ is a value that is assigned to someone after they take a test. Technically, it describes the relationship between one's mental age as defined by the test and their chronological age. To calculate IQ, we divide mental age by chronological age and multiply by 100. The way we calculate IQ today is a little bit different, but he laid the groundwork for today's researchers. Terman also contributed to mental testing with his studies of gifted children. He conducted the longest running psychology research project of all time. In 1921, he tested more than 1,000 students in California using the Stanford Binet scale. Unfortunately, the sample was not representative of the US population. The students came from families that were mostly middle to upper class, white, Protestant or Jewish, and the parents tended to be working professionals. He retested this group of students 10, 25, and 35 years later. After he died, one of his graduate students took over the project and conducted 2 more follow-ups, one in 1960 and one in 1986. So they had 6 sets of data over an extended period of time. At the time, many people thought gifted children would grow up to be maladjusted adults and that they were a little bit strange. His results challenged these stereotypes. Not only were the gifted children smarter than their peers, but they also were more productive, were more successful later on in life. They were physically healthier as adults, and they were overall better adjusted to adulthood. One of the reasons this study succeeded was because of Terman's dedication to his research. His participants were known as termites because they were dedicated, loyal to him and to the studies. His response rates were sometimes 95%. That is unheard of. Unheard of. We just don't see response rates like that. But because Terman was so well liked and because they were loyal to this study, he was able to collect an enormous amount of data over a span of several decades. Although Terman's study of gifted children is one of the best known, he was not the first person to study gifted students. That accolade goes to Leda Hollingworth, the mother of gifted children. In 1916, she earned her PhD from Columbia University, where she studied with Edward Thorndike. After graduation, she stayed at Columbia and ended up teaching the first course about gifted children in 1918. Several years later, in 1926, she published the first textbook about gifted children and how to educate them. She recommended that gifted children be placed in special classes with other gifted children at about the same age. She also recommended that their curriculum include both the traditional curriculum that the other students would experience, as well as extra activities above and beyond the basics. This was designed to challenge them and push them just as the other students were being pushed in the traditional classroom. In the early 1900s, she advocated for gender equality and for women's right to vote. In her dissertation, she studied 23 women and their mental abilities throughout their menstrual cycles. She had them take multiple tests at multiple times during the 28 days. She then compared their results with the test results from male participants. They tested things like reaction time, steadiness, how quickly they tired, and how quickly they could learn new things. When she crunched the numbers, she did not find evidence of gender differences. Males and females scored very similarly across all of these tests. Her dissertation was extremely important to debunking some of those early stereotypes that we talked about in previous lectures. Many people thought that women were less suitable for intellectually demanding jobs, in part because of the menstrual cycle, that once a month women are incapacitated, unable to think clearly, and therefore cannot work during that time. Her studies provided evidence to the contrary.